Welcome back to Post Whatever with Ken Nishikawa. Today, I will be diving deep into the realm of the most difficult language in the world. Plus some tips for Japanese or any foreign language learners as a bonus. If you're an expat living in Japan, as sure as eggs is eggs, you have been told more than once how difficult Japanese is to master. I was also told more than once how difficult English is. In fact, come to think of it, almost everyone around the world seems prone to announcing that their mother tongue is particularly challenging to learn. I'm so sorry to sound so merciless, but this has led me to the conclusion that declaring my language is really difficult to learn is effectively a roundabout way of saying, because we speak that language fluently and effortlessly, we are collectively, ever so slightly, a superior race. What a profound and mature observation. Now that I have established my feelings on this matter, I can proceed to show you that, at least for English speakers, or indeed anyone who speaks a language belonging to the Indo-European family, the notion of Japanese being one of the most difficult languages, or possibly the most difficult language to become proficient in, is not entirely groundless. The Foreign Service Institute in the United States created a list based on the experience training American diplomats, indicating the approximate time needed for an English speaker to learn a specific language. It is, in other words, a league table of linguistic suffering. The easiest ones are listed in Category 1, which covers languages that take the average English speaker, or potential American diplomat, half a year, or about 24 weeks, or 600 hours to become proficient in. This includes the Scandinavian languages, except Finnish, which is one of only a handful of non-Indo-European languages in Europe, the others being Estonian, Hungarian, and Basque. Category 1 also includes most Latin-derived languages such as French, Spanish, Italian, and also Dutch. Category 2, 30 weeks or 750 hours, contains at present only one language, and that language is German. Well, English being a Germanic language, this feels somewhat weird, but whatever. Category 3, 36 weeks or 900 hours, languages including Indonesian and Swahili. Category 4, 44 weeks or 1,100 hours. In other words, roughly twice as long as Italian or French. These are languages such as Turkish, Russian, Polish, Czech, and most other Eastern European languages, as well as many languages of South Asia and Middle East. Within Category 4, there is an asterisked subgroup languages, considered even more demanding than plain Category 4. These include Finnish, Estonian, and Hungarian, those European languages of non-Indo-European origin, plus Vietnamese and Mongolian. Quite a random selection, really. Category 5. One has to study 88 weeks or 2,200 hours on average in order to become fluent in. So even if you're fully immersed, it would still take, holidays accounted for, at least 2 years to master. These are considered some of the most difficult languages for English speakers or American diplomats to learn, and they include Chinese, Korean, and Arabic. Well, kind of understandable. And then there is Category 5 with an asterisk again. Even more difficult than the language I just mentioned. According to the Foreign Service Institute in the US, it will take on average more than 88 weeks to become proficient. And there is only one language awarded this distinction. Yes, you guessed it. Japanese. So, does that make Japanese the most difficult language in the world? I used to write a blog about 15 years ago. Like most of my ventures, it went largely unnoticed, except for one entry entitled 世界で最も難しい言語 the most difficult language in the world. For a while, it gained a modest but genuine online presence because whenever Japanese speakers or Japanese people searched for that phrase, the most difficult language in the world, in Japanese of course, my blog appeared at the top of the search result. Not anymore though, because it's an old blog, but for a while, I was the internet leading authority on the subject, which is both gratifying and alarming. In the said blog, I concluded that one simply cannot identify a single language as the most difficult, because it is entirely relative. Put simply, the most difficult language for you to learn is the one that is grammatically, phonologically, structurally, syntactically, and above all, culturally most different from your own mother tongue. The Foreign Service Institute list, therefore, is not a universal ranking of linguistic difficulty or complexity. It is a ranking of how different these languages are from English, and from English-speaking culture specifically. So this does mean that Japan, not only linguistically but culturally, is more different from the West English-speaking countries and European countries in general than Southeast Asia or Sub-Saharan African countries, which is quite fascinating, really. I also wrote in that old blog that an easy way to detect how similar or different a language is from your own is to use an old internet machine translation tool, from circa 2012. When you translate Dutch or French into English, it did a reasonably good job. You might find an occasional peculiar phrase, but the meaning came through. If, however, you translated Japanese into English using the same old translation engine, it went completely psychedelic. Like the collection works of Hambo, rendered by someone who has never seen a sentence before. So just out of curiosity, I tried this experiment with several languages. English, of course, but also French, Russian, Chinese, and so on. Translating each into Japanese. And they all came out pretty incomprehensible. However, the language whose computer-translated output was most comprehensive as Japanese text turned out to be Korean, which suggests that, first of all, Korean is grammatically, structurally, and syntactically similar to Japanese, and therefore, technically, it should be considerably easier for a Korean speaker to learn Japanese because of their proximity than for an English speaker to do the same. Conversely, for a Japanese speaker, Korean is theoretically more accessible than English ever will be. Similarly, Frisian, which is sometimes erroneously identified as a Dutch dialect, but it is actually a distinct language in its own right, and in fact the closest living language to English, would be far more accessible to an English speaker than a Japanese speaker attempting the same feat. This is what I mean by the most difficult language in the world being entirely relative. Needless to say, given how sophisticated machine translations become of late, especially with the advent of AI, this experiment is considerably harder to replicate today. Well, I realized this episode so far hasn't done much to boost the confidence of English speakers who are learning or thinking of learning Japanese. I am awfully sorry. However, confidence, as we shall see, is the name of the game when it comes to speaking any foreign language. I told you in the earlier episode that I used to teach English in Tokyo, but I also used to teach Japanese in London as well, and most of my students were beginners, British, quite reasonably intimidated by the prospect of learning the devil's language. The most important first step in learning any new language is being able to express how you feel, what you want or need, using the limited vocabulary you have at your disposal. This requires two things, I think. Imagination and confidence. Imagination because there are so many nouns and verbs you will not know. In the beginning, adjectives and adverbs are largely decorations. Pleasant to have, makes you sound a little bit more sophisticated or intelligent or whatever, but not strictly necessary for survival. About 20 years ago, I was directing a TV program. We interviewed a French gentleman whose English was, to put it diplomatically, at the elementary stage. And it was a television interview conducted in English. Millions of viewers would be watching this. It must have been quite nerve-wracking for him. And yet, he pulled it off rather beautifully. The finest example, he didn't even know the word camera. So instead, he said, a photo machine, or machine photo, deploying limited tools to maximum effect. Rather like good old Tommies in the Second World War, whose equipment was frequently inferior to that of their enemies, the Jerrys, who had some of the best tanks and so on, often in ways for which it was never intended. So long as it helped achieve the objective, it did not matter in the slightest. And that's exactly what one has to do with one's limited vocabulary. Use your imagination and use it in the most effective way, regardless of grammar or the conventional way of phrasing. And this brings me to the second, and I would argue, more crucial element, confidence. Never be afraid of making mistakes. It doesn't matter if your grammar isn't impeccable, so long as you are able to convey your meaning. Pronunciation, the same principle applies. I think the notion of good accent or sophisticated pronunciation is entirely subjective and, if I may be so bold, something of an illusion. If people genuinely cannot understand what you're saying, then yes, some adjustment may be warranted. But if it doesn't impede communication, I would not lose a moment's sleep over it. I would even go so far as to say the idea of one language or accent sounding more beautiful or sophisticated than other is rather silly. Linguistic beauty has infinitely more to do with the interlocutor than the language itself. I have heard people make English sound like music, and I have heard others make it sound like a blocked drain. The language is entirely innocent. A linguistic specialist once made this point, and I find myself in complete accordance with him, that language examinations are the single worst and most damaging thing you can impose on someone trying to learn a new language. Exams create the illusion that language must be used with appropriate vocabulary in the appropriate grammatical context at all times. And yet, native speakers make grammatical errors on a daily basis. Extremely common phrases such as, me and my friend went out, how are you, I'm doing good, are, strictly speaking, both incorrect. You would fail an exam saying these phrases, or writing these phrases. And yet, increasingly fewer and fewer native speakers, especially young ones, would say, my friend and I went out, or I'm doing well. This is why I maintain that language examinations, at least for beginners, are not merely useless, they are actually harmful. Hereby, I call upon every language school and educational organization to abolish them immediately. I'm aware this is unlikely to happen, but I feel better for having said it, so there you go. Once you're fully comfortable expressing yourself in the language you are learning, then you can make a considered choice to improve your grammatical accuracy or even pronunciation if you want. But this must never be the first priority. The cart before the horse, linguistically speaking, is utterly counterproductive. Okay, so people may laugh at your errors or your pronunciations. This is simply part of the process of learning. I liken language learning to learning how to play the guitar. You cannot play well without some initial discomfort, like your fingertips really hurt in the beginning of playing guitar. But if you keep practicing, they will eventually harden and the pain will be replaced by your confidence and joy of playing music. The same goes for the language learning. Confidence, not pride, not ego, but genuine confidence is what will carry you through. Now, back to my teaching days. I always made the point of telling my students, like I said, mostly British, so English-speaking students, beginners, some specific linguistic facts about Japanese, because context, I believe, helps eliminate some sense of apprehension. Admittedly, the writing system is challenging. Japanese uses multiple scripts simultaneously, hiragana, katakana, and, worst of all, kanji. the last of which involves thousands of non-phonetic characters with no resemblance whatsoever to the Latin alphabet. This is genuinely demanding, and there is no point pretending otherwise. After the war, there was a talk of abolishing kanji altogether apparently, and I know which way I would have cast my vote. With that being said, about grammar, the overall concept of the Japanese language is violently different from English. I'll give you that. However, that doesn't necessarily mean it is more difficult. Tense, for instance. Japanese operates with only two tenses, past and non-past. A single form that covers both present and future. No future perfect, no past perfect continuous, no present perfect progressive. For indicating that some event will take place in the future, one simply adds a word like tomorrow or next week. Compared to the Baroque temporal architecture of English language, you might even find it a considerable relief. Because Japanese uses subject and object markers, particles such as wa and o, which are kind of a headache for the initial learners, but once you get used to it, because of these particles, word order plays almost no grammatical role in Japanese. Whereas in English, word order determines the meaning, the nature of the sentence. You are okay is affirmative. Are you okay is interrogative. In Japanese, it's a syntactic anarchy. For example, the direct translation of I love you is watashi I wa anata you, or aishiteru love, I you love. That's how a textbook would tell you. But this can be rearranged, and people do it all the time. Like English, watashi wa aishiteru anata o, I love you. It works perfectly. Or aishiteru anata o, watashi wa, love you I. Even anata o aishiteru watashi wa, you love I or you love me, which would change the meaning completely in English, but in Japanese it still means the same, I love you, thanks to the particles. This may be bewildering for some English speakers, but once you get used to the idea, it is almost liberating. Another misconception concerns pronunciation. Japanese may sound unfamiliar, but linguists generally agree that the fewer consonant clusters a language has, the easier it is to pronounce. Good news, Japanese is heavily, and I mean heavily, vowel-based. 5 pure vowels, I, U, E, O, we call it. In Europe, you would say I, O. Same thing. Clean consonants. No particularly harsh sounds like or f. It is, in phonetic terms, closer to Italian than, say, Polish or Arabic. In theory, and I do acknowledge that theory and practice are not always on speaking terms, it is a relatively accessible language to pronounce. Granted, Japanese does have grammatical rules that serve very little or no functional purposes. But once you have internalized them, in other words, you become comfortable with them, you will find there are far fewer irregular verbs, unexpected inflections, or arbitrary exceptions than, say, in English. In fact, there's almost none. So, before you declare that Japanese is too difficult to learn, I would ask you to consider what I have just outlined. In several respects, Japanese is considerably less complex than English. The key is to open your mind to an entirely different linguistic concept, and with it, an entirely different culture and set of values, because these are, in my opinion, inseparable. At least in the early stage of learning any language, do not question it or judge it. Simply accept it and imitate it exactly as you once done, absorbing your own mother tongue in your largely forgotten past. Believe me, it is quicker. This has been Post Whatever with Ken Nishikawa. If you found any of that remotely useful or even mildly diverting, do consider liking and subscribing, because I was told it helps immensely and it doesn't cost you time or money. Until next time, if you're learning a new language, I wish you the very best of luck. You're in for potentially a great deal of fun and life-altering experience. And remember, let them laugh, for you will be the one laughing in the end.